Yo, what is up, guys? Welcome to today's episode of the Live, Train, Perform podcast. I'm your host, Shaun Kober. Every now and again, I do a Q&A session where people send me a DM or comment on my Q&A post on my social media platforms. You can find them at coach_Kobes on Instagram, Kobes, and also Performance Functional Training on Facebook. For those interested, I also have a YouTube channel at Performance Functional Training where I upload a heap of free content and I also reference them sometimes in these podcast episodes. Let's get started. The first question comes in from Aiden, who I know from my time in the Australian Army, and he writes, "So my question is a rookie one, but one I struggle a bit with when putting it to practice, and that is the balance with weight training and cardio endurance. For example, I'm trying to smash a 3.2 kilometer run and along the way improve all my 400, 800 meter interval times, etc. I've slowly improved them over the years whilst continuing average volume strength training, but obviously that hits a wall very soon. Even doing 3 to 5 reps of 3 to 5 sets of back squat in the week cripples me for my runs, which I find odd because it's such low volume. What is the most effective way of progressing both side by side in your opinion, or should someone who is not a crazily talented runner cease the strength training altogether until the run time is achieved?" Excellent question, and I'm going to dive into some different periodization models as we go through the answer to this question. So first of all, we need to understand what periodization is. What is periodization? It is essentially having a goal and then working backwards from that goal and putting these processes in place on a daily, weekly, monthly basis that is moving you in the right direction. So we need to have a look at what our goal is, and then we need to have a look at where we're at right now, and then we essentially work backwards to fill in the gaps. Now, you can find out more information about how to do proper goal setting in one of my first episodes, which I'll have linked in the show notes. But essentially, periodization is having a plan and then sticking to that plan and going through different models and different blocks of periodization. Now, there's 3 main types of periodization. Before I get into the individual models of periodization, though, I do want to say that there's a million ways to skin a cat. So you need to find the one that works best for you, and that's looking at what your strengths are and looking at what your weaknesses are, and also having a look at what your mindset is, because some periodization models work really well for some people and other periodization models don't work so well for some people. And that's because some periodization models will have you following the same program for 6 to 8 to 12 weeks, whereas other models like the conjugate system, which I'll dive into in a moment, essentially has you training different sessions, different body parts, different modalities, different movement patterns, etc., every single training session. And I'll give an example towards the end of the episode of how I use the different periodization models to elicit the results that I want with not only my one-on-one clients, my fighters, my PT clients, my general population clients, but some of the sports teams and rugby teams and things like that I've worked with in the past. So the 3 main periodization models that I'm going to talk about in today's episode are the linear model, the non-linear model or undulating model, which I'm going to refer to from here on out as the conjugate system, and we also have block periodization. And each one of these periodization models is or can be used in different circumstances for different scenarios to elicit different results. And I'll give an example of each one of these as we go through. So the first model that I'm going to talk about is the linear model. Now, the linear model is a very simple, easy to understand periodization model that essentially uses progressive overload to work through a program for roughly 12 weeks, 8, 10, 12 weeks-ish. Now, the linear model is primarily focused on one specific adaptation. There's something called specific adaptation to impose demands, the SAID principle. And this states that whatever you do is whatever you'll adapt to. So if I'm training a powerlifter, for example, we're going to be focusing primarily on strength. It's all about maximum force output. If I'm training an endurance runner, however, my training protocols are going to be a lot different. We're going to be focusing on the ability to produce smaller amounts of force, but for extended periods of time over long durations. So again, that's going to dictate my exercise selection. It's going to dictate my exercise order, my sets, my reps, my rest periods, my intensity, etc., etc. All of the variables come into play with every single modality that we're training for. So I won't go too deep in the different modalities of stability, mobility, strength, speed, power, endurance, energy system, conditioning, corrective exercise, rehabilitation, blah, 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 blah. But it is important to understand that there are a lot of different components that myself as a strength and conditioning coach is considering when we're looking at structuring a strength and conditioning program for an athlete. And not only an athlete, but for general population clients as well. It is important to change your modalities and change your style of training, because you will adapt to whatever you're doing fairly quickly, roughly 8 to 12 weeks. Okay, your body's going to get really good at whatever you're doing, and then it's going to plateau and you're not going to go anywhere. And I see this happen all the time with things like CrossFit and F45 and these group class training protocols that just get people in exercising rather than training, as people get really good results for about 6 to 8 weeks and then they plateau and they've got nowhere to go and they don't know what to do from there. So then they start taking more and more extreme measures with adding more exercise in and reducing calories and all that type of stuff. So that's a good point, and it's a good segue to go into the periodization model, because when you're doing these group style classes, and if you're one of those people that goes into the gym and you're trying to do something different every single time because you like novelty, well, guess what? You're probably going to be spinning your wheels a lot of the time when it comes to all of these attributes of, strength and conditioning. We're looking at building the skill. We're looking at practicing and refining technique, because technique and the skill of completing a movement is so much more important than just going through the motions. You got to think about what your intent is with every single exercise that you do. I know that if I'm prescribing a deadlift, for example, I'm looking at loading up and strengthening the entire posterior chain. If I'm sprinting, however, I know that I'm working through that alactic energy system, and I'm looking to produce as much speed and force as rapidly as possible. If I'm looking at Olympic lifting or box jumps or some med ball throws or slams or something like that, that is all about rate of force development, which is a combination of strength, which is high force production, and speed, which is rapid force production. Now, I just want to pause here for a moment and discuss this in a little bit more detail before I give some more examples on the different periodization models, because pretty much every single time I sit down with a new client, and I did this with my UFC champion, Petr Yan. We started training together almost 3 years ago now, right before he signed his first UFC contract, and he's Russian. I don't speak any Russian. He barely spoke any English back then, so I sat down with his manager, who also works at Tiger Muay Thai, and I was like, cool, man, let's get to work. Like, what do we want to work on? What's your focus? What's your primary objective when it comes to strength and conditioning? And he said, I want to work on everything. I want to be stronger. I want to be faster. I want to be more powerful. I want to have a bigger engine. I want to be able to go for longer, etc., etc. And I was like, all right, cool. We need to go through this periodized model where we build one foundational aspect of, say, strength. Then we go into the next foundational aspect, which would be power. Then we go into the next foundational aspect, which would be speed. And then we start looking at speed and power endurance. And then we start looking at energy system conditioning. And all of these attributes are flowing on and building upon that foundation. And strength is the foundation for every other physical attribute, and should be one of the first places that we start, because strength is your ability to produce force, and stability is your ability to resist force. Now, if you're unstable, then you can't produce force. So you need to have stability, which is a form of strength. Okay, and then strength needs to be built, because without strength, you can't be fast, you can't have speed, you can't have power, you can't have endurance, okay? And if you increase your strength and then you train those other attributes, you'll get so much more out of them. And I'll give an example of what I mean by that a little bit further down the line. But first, let's get stuck into the linear periodization model. So linear periodization is typically the most commonly used style of training, and it's probably the style that you did when you first started lifting. And this is what I did when I first started lifting when I was like 15, 16 years old. Trying to get bigger in the gym, I was following a linear periodization model. And I'll give a couple of examples of how this works in a moment. But the linear periodization model is great for building a strong foundation and progressing in one variable. So again, going back to the power lifter, if I'm working with a power lifter, then they're going to primarily use the linear periodization model simply because they don't need to build all of these other aspects that are required for more athletic sports and endeavors. They're all about producing maximum force. So that is the one attribute that we're trying to produce and we're trying to elicit through our training program, and that is maximal force production. So how I might run a linear periodized model here is we might do 3 sets of 5 of our bench, deadlift and squat over the course of a week. Then the following week we do 4 sets of 5. The next week we do 5 sets of 5. And then week 4, what I'm going to do is build up to and test my 5 rep max. And then I might test my 3 rep max. And then I'm going to test my 1 rep max. And this is Wendler's 5-3-1 strength training protocol. Now, something to note here is that if I'm running this program, there's a 4-week program where we're building up and increasing our intensity, we're increasing our volume, and then we're testing on week 4. So on week 5, what I'm going to do is have a deload week. Okay, I'm still going to get into the gym, but I'm going to really reduce that volume and intensity, and it might be more like bodybuilding style training where we're just going in, getting a pump, getting the blood flowing, etc. And that's going to completely depend on my client. But then there's 5 weeks. I'm going to rotate through that exact same thing. 3 sets of 5 week 1, 4 sets of 5 week 2, 5 sets of 5 week 3, then test 5-3-1. And the goal is to be adding weight week after week. Now, adding weight is not the only variable to change here, okay? But I'm just using that as an example. I will go into the different variables in another podcast. It's way too deep, way too complex to go into in this one. I just want to give some very simple examples. Now, what I want to do is give an example for an endurance athlete. So if your goal is to run a marathon, or let's say your goal is to run a half marathon and you've never run before, you don't like running, you just thought you'd set yourself a challenge, okay? So again, we're looking at progressive overload. So what you might do is go week 1 might be, you might run 3 kilometers 3 times that week. And then the next week you might run 4 kilometers 3 times that week. And then the next week might be 5 kilometers 3 times that week. Then week 4, you're going to use progressive overload. You're going to drop back to 3 kilometers, but now you're going to do that 4 times per week. The next week will be 4 times 4 kilometer runs, and the following week will be 4 times 5 kilometer runs. And you might use that same protocol the following week where you do 5 runs at 3 kilometers, then 4 kilometers, then 5 kilometers. And if we have a look at that total volume there, week 1 is 3 by 3 kilometers. There's 9 kilometers total for the week. And then the next week is 3 by 4, which is 12 kilometers total. Then 3 by 5, 15 kilometers total. And then we go back to the start. And now we're doing 4 rounds or 4 times per week at 3 kilometers, back to 12 kilometers, then 15 kilometers, 18 kilometers, and you're building up to 21 kilometers. Okay, so there's many ways to skin the cat, but there's just a very brief example of how the linear periodization model works. Now, point to note here is that the linear periodization model is really fucking good at building the skill and the technique of one attribute. All right, so if you are one of those athletes that competes in kind of a monostructural sport like powerlifting or endurance running or sprinting or something like that, then using the linear periodization model is a really good way to build up and peak at the correct time. Okay, if you are like a tactical athlete, like a military or police or first responder or something like that, or you play a multifaceted sport that requires a lot of these other athletic attributes, then the linear periodization model is probably not the best model to use. However, it can be a really good model to use with beginners and intermediate people who are looking to build a solid foundation, because you need to have a solid foundation to be able to then build the peak of the pyramid. The bigger your base, the higher your peak. Now, I just want to pause here and touch on this in a little bit more detail, because I did just say that the linear model is very good for beginners and intermediate. However, I would use the linear model if I wanted to focus on one specific aspect. For example, if I knew I had a CrossFit competition or something like that coming up and I wanted to work on my Olympic lifting, okay, my Olympic lifting is limited by my mobility in some areas, my ankles, my shoulders, my wrists. So if I wanted to give myself the best chance in a CrossFit competition, for example, I've already got good strength, stability, speed, power, conditioning, okay, and gymnastics, but my Olympic lifting would let me down, particularly the full variations of the Olympic lifts. So if I wanted to set myself up for putting myself in the best position, then I'd have to dedicate, say, 8 to 12 weeks of going through an Olympic lifting training program. Now, I'm going to put all of the other aspects aside and focus just on the skill and the technique of the Olympic lifts. Now, I'm obviously going to need to do some mobility work to allow me to get into better positions, so then I can strengthen those positions. So that would be a way that I would use the linear model. So obviously this is a very dense and complex topic. We've just gotten through the linear periodization model. Next up, we're going to move on to what I call the conjugate system. Others call it the undulating system or the non-linear periodization model. And this is essentially where we're working on one adaptation primarily, whilst also focusing on a secondary adaptation. Now, this system is very good for people who have a really good foundation already, okay, and then they want to focus on strength, whilst also building power, okay, and we might follow that for a period of time, and then we might focus on power with a little bit of strength, depending on the athlete, depending on the person. And again, I will tie all of this together towards the end of the session, but just for education purposes, we want our adaptations that we're training side by side to complement each other. So strength and power go very well together. Okay, power and speed go very well together. Speed and endurance also go well together. Okay, but going from strength and endurance together doesn't work so well. So an example of how I would structure a week for one of my fighters would be if we need to focus on strength, for example, they've got really good speed, they've got good endurance and good cardio, good conditioning, then we need to add some strength and power. Okay, I might go, strength is the number one priority right now. We need to bump that up. So let's work on strength 3 days per week, and then we'll complement that with power work 2 days per week, okay? And I might follow that for, say, 6 weeks. And then what I might do is switch that around and go, cool, let's do power 3 days per week and strength 2 days per week, okay? And I might run a 8 to 10 to 12 week block there. Once I've done that block, then I move on to the next cycle, which might look something like this, okay? We might do power 3 days per week and then speed, endurance and conditioning 2 days per week, and I might follow that for 4 to 6 weeks, and then I'm going to switch that around. We do more speed, endurance and conditioning 3 days per week, whilst maintaining the power 2 days per week. So this is the undulating system or the conjugate system, which is very good for more advanced athletes and those that play team sports and have longer seasons where they're playing or competing, 10 to 20 times within a season. So this is the model that I would typically use within a season. And again, I'll tie all of this in together and I'll show you guys how I use all of these different methods towards the end of the session. And the final periodization model that I'll talk about in this episode is the block periodization model, which is arguably one of the newer models that the strength and conditioning industry is starting to move towards. And I really like the block periodization model. And it is essentially kind of how I use it is kind of like taking the linear periodization model and the undulating or conjugate periodization model, and I kind of put them together. Now, what a block periodization model looks like is kind of like a stripped down, shorter version of the linear model where we're focusing on one adaptation, but I also use some of the principles of the conjugate system where I'm focusing on a secondary adaptation. And again, these adaptations lead from one phase into the next phase, into the next phase. And this is basically what I'm doing with my fighters at the moment. I'm taking them through a general physical preparation model where we're focusing on all of these different adaptations. So an example of how I use the block model is what I'm doing with my team right now, and that is working in 4-week blocks. So the first 4 weeks was all about mobility and stability. So I was teaching these guys the tools that they could use in their own time prior to going into, their skill classes, their striking classes, their MMA classes, their grappling classes, etc. Once we got through the first 3 to 4 weeks, then we started adding in some strength-based work. And then we progressively added in some power work, and then we progressively added in some speed work, okay? And that was working in 3 to 4 week blocks where one phase, the mobility, led into stability. And as I went from stability into strength, then I started dropping out the mobility stuff because they could do that in their own time. And then when I moved in towards the power, then I start taking away a little bit of the stability work, and then I move into speed. Now working speed and power. Now I start taking out some of the strength-based work, and then I'll move into speed and endurance and conditioning, and I'll start taking out that power-based work, okay? And I'm progressively moving exercises in and out and giving these introductions to these exercises, these movements, these skills, these techniques, the first week, and then we build, test, and then move on to the next phase. And I'm slowly introducing certain exercises and movements, whilst I'm also progressively taking some of these exercises and movements out. So sometimes we're not doing exactly the same sessions. It is important to follow a training program, okay, but the sessions are not exactly the same. There's going to be a lot of carryover from one session to the next, and there's going to be a lot of the same or similar movements, but it's not the exact same training session each time because I want to progressively move through each one of those phases. Now, this is not how the traditional block style periodization model looks, but this is how I've found to work really well for me with my own training and also with my athletes. And I find it's a really good way to structure training for general population clients as well, because it kind of gives you that solid training program and that ability to practice the skill and technique of all of these different types of movements, but also to give you a little bit of novel stimulus where you're not doing the same thing over and over and over again. Okay, so I really like the block model, and it's kind of a combination of the linear system and the conjugate system. But it really depends on the person that I've got in front of me, what their strengths are, what their weaknesses are, if they've got any specific adaptations that we need to focus on. Okay, so what I'll do now is give an example of how I use these different models and the people that I've used them with and the sports teams that I've used them with for different results. First of all, I'll talk about working with rugby teams because this is using all of these different systems and it's applying them at different times to elicit the results that you want. So a very easy example of how I would structure my strength and conditioning program with a rugby team, which is what I've done numerous times. During the off season, let's say grand finals played, the boys have a couple of weeks off, then they get back into the gym. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have about 5 to 6 months of off season prior to the season kicking off. So I'm going to follow more of a linear style program where I might follow a hypertrophy program for 6 weeks. Okay. And then I'm going to go through a deload, and then we're going to move into a strength phase for 6 weeks. Then we might go through a deload. Then we'll go into a power phase for 6 weeks. Then we deload, go into a speed phase for 6 weeks. Okay, so what I'm doing is building each one of those attributes and dedicating an entire block to each one of those attributes. So that is the linear periodization model, and that might lead me up to the season. Then what I'm doing within the season is I might work on, particularly the first half of the season, I might work on a block model. So now I need to allocate sessions to my strength, speed, power, and endurance. So what this might look like is we might follow a strength phase for 2 weeks. Okay, and then on that second week of the strength phase, now we're adding in some power work for our warm-up, which is priming our central nervous system. We follow that for 2 weeks. I do power for 2 weeks, and on week 2 of the power, then I introduce the speed-based work as part of our warm-up, which sets the boys up for the following phase, which is going to be speed. And we're also working on that endurance and energy system conditioning. So that might take me through, say, 6 to 8 weeks of the first portion of the season. Then what I'm going to do, I've built those adaptations, I've built those skills, I've built those attributes. Then I might switch to more of a conjugate system, which is where I'm essentially training all of these adaptations throughout the season. I'm keeping them at peak for longer. Okay, with the linear model, it's good for peaking hypertrophy, and then good for peaking strength, and then good for peaking power, and then good for peaking speed. Okay, but what happens when you move from one phase to the next is you will start losing some of those adaptations from the previous phase, and particularly the previous phase before that. So when I go in season, it's all about maintaining and extending that peak period. So this is where we might be bringing it home, 2 months out from the grand final. The last 2 months, we're looking at a conjugate system where we might start the training session with some stability and mobility based work, and then we're going to go into some speed and power work, and then we'll round it out with some strength-based work. If the boys are tired and they've had a massive game on the weekend, the boys are a little bit beat up and sore, then we might go into some hypertrophy-based work. And sometimes I might do all of that within one session, or what I might do is maybe do 1 day of strength and power, 1 day of speed and power and endurance, and then 1 day of activation-based work. Now, this really depends on the team that I'm working with, whether they're a professional team or an amateur team, and how many days a week I'm training with them. And the same thing applies for all of my fighters. So this is essentially what I'm doing with those guys, rolling through these block phase training programs so that we can elicit these results and build upon these skills, and then we add the endurance and the conditioning towards the end. Now, we're implementing all of these things throughout that training program. Now, that example that I just gave was for a team that I have for long periods of time. So I might have a rugby team for like 8 months, 10 months for the year. So we're looking at the preseason program, which is primarily linear. Then we're looking at the start of the season where we're rolling through a block periodization, and then to bring it home towards the end of the season, we're running a conjugate system where I'm basically just implementing any of those skill development sessions into the week as needed. Whatever we need to work on, whatever the game plan is, whatever the coach comes up with, I'm going to cater my strength and conditioning sessions to that overall plan. Now, something I want to say here is that when I'm working with fighters, for the most part, I don't get these guys long term. And this is why I'm running a current general physical preparation program with some of the fighters at Tiger right now, is because it's been a missing link in the game plan for a long period since I've been in Thailand. Now, for the most part, the majority of the fighters that I get, I might only get them for like 4 to 6 to maybe 8 weeks if I'm lucky. So I need to prioritize which one of those adaptations is most important, and then start dedicating time, energy, effort, and training in towards eliciting those adaptations that we're looking for. So an example of this is, again, going back to Petr Yan. So he's fought in the UFC 7 times. He's now the bantamweight champion, and I've trained him for 6 of those 7 fights. And when we first started, it was all about general physical preparation. This was when he signed his UFC contract, and this was all about building those foundational skills. Now, as we went further and further down that journey together, then what I started doing was looking at the fight that he had coming up, who he was fighting against, what his game plan was, and then I would target specific adaptations. So for example, before he fought Jimmy Rivera, I only had like 4 to 5 weeks with him. And I looked at Jimmy Rivera and I studied his movement and I studied what he was doing. And he's a strong dude. He's a grappler. And Petr Yan's not as strong as him. So I didn't have enough time in that 4 to 5 weeks to build his strength enough to compete with Jimmy. So what I had to do was look at what Peter was good at and go, all right, cool. He's really good with his balance, coordination, timing, accuracy, speed, endurance, cardio. So let's work on those. So what I did was ran a speed, power, endurance, conditioning based program for like 5 weeks and used a linear model for him. And that worked really well. Then when he fought against Uriah Faber, then I had more time. I had 6 weeks with him then. I had more time to develop more strength. And I didn't really need to focus so much on the speed and the power-based work because he was already really good there. So I just added some more strength and he ended up getting the finish. Then when he trained for Aldo, it was a bit of a mixed bag. We had to focus on all of those adaptations. And again, I had to prioritize and do the most important things at the start of the session. So I was focusing on that speed and power-based work. And I added a fair bit of strength in there as well. But I was incorporating that into our kind of conditioning-based sessions that we're doing now. I'm not going to go too deep here because it is very complex, but essentially what you need to do is prioritize what the most important thing is and then dedicate your time, energy, and effort into putting those processes in place for that training program that you're working on. So that was the long as fuck answer. Let me give you the shorter answer. Ask yourself this question: which adaptation is most important to you? Is it the strength or is it the cardio endurance? Now, think about it like this. You have a new UFC game. You've got UFC 4 and you make your own avatar. You make your character to reflect yourself. Now, you're going to be allocated 100 points to use every single day with your training. Now, are you going to allocate those points to strength, speed, power, endurance, conditioning, striking, offense, defense, grappling, wrestling, BJJ, etc., etc.? Now, it's the same thing with real life. You only have a certain amount of attributes to push towards any one of these adaptations. So, for example, I know you, so I'm going to say that you're a strong enough dude. If you put in 6 to 8 to 10 weeks of hard work on strength, you're probably not going to get massive changes there. However, if you dedicated that same time to your running-based work and your skill and technique of running, you're probably going to push those numbers up a lot quicker than you would on the strength for the same amount of time. So it's all about that cost-benefit ratio. And what I'd suggest is backing off on the strength work and maybe dedicating yourself to maybe 6 weeks of running training where you might run, 3 times a week, 4 times a week, and you might lift once or twice a week. With your lifting, you're not focusing on heavy strength-based training. You're focusing more on hypertrophy. You might do like a 1-day full body routine where you're not lifting super heavy. You're lifting moderate weights, but it's bodybuilding style and you're choosing one exercise per muscle group and, you're only hitting 3 sets of 10 or something like that. And you're not, hammering yourself. It's more about that mind-muscle connection, that time under tension, that intramuscular tension of squeezing the muscles and feeling the muscles, rather than lifting super heavy, which is a neural adaptation which fries the central nervous system. Then what you might do is, say, twice a week you might work on the anaerobic energy system, and twice a week you might work on the aerobic energy system. So let me give you an example of how I would structure a program for you at the moment. I'm only saying this because I know you. If I didn't know anything about you, then I'd be hesitant to make any suggestions and recommendations. But let's say Monday and Tuesday are both run days. Wednesday is our lifting day. Thursday, Friday is run day. So Monday is going to be a high intensity sprint-based session. So if you're working on your 400 meters, then you might literally run 400 meters at like 75, 80%, and you might just do 3 to 4 reps there. Have a couple of minutes rest, repeat, and the goal is to maintain that same quality and that same pace. Then on Tuesday, that might be like 1 kilometer tempo runs, where you might do that 3 to 4 times. You'll run 1 kilometer at a fairly fast pace, rest a couple of minutes, and repeat. Wednesday, you'll get into the gym. You're going to get some lifting in, send that signal to maintain muscle mass and strength. Then Thursday, you're going to do some more semi-sprint based work, where you might choose a hill and you might choose 30, 40, 50, 60 seconds, where you're getting as far up that hill as you can in that time frame. Rest 4 to 5 minutes, repeat that 3 to 4 times. Then on Friday, it's going to be a longer endurance-based run, where you might choose 5 kilometers. Okay, and then the following week, you're going to repeat that. If you did 3 to 4 sets of the 400 meter tempo runs, then you might go 4 to 5 sets. Then the same thing with Tuesday. If you did 3 to 4 sets on the first week, then you might do 4 to 5 sets on the second week. Get in some lifting on Wednesday. Then Thursday is going to be back to your hill sprints, 3 to 4 sets. You might bump that up to 4 to 5. Then Friday, you might keep 5 kilometers, but you can try and beat your pace. Or you might bump it up to 6 kilometers, or you might run 5 kilometers and add some hills in there. So there's a million different ways to skin the cat, and there's a million different ways to use progressive overload to elicit the responses that you want. But you basically need to choose the system that's going to work best for you. You need to prioritize. You need to look at what is most important for you at the time, and then dedicate that time on developing a decent program that's going to elicit those responses. Once you get the response from your running, then you can go back to a more conjugate style system, where you might go lifting 3 times a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and then you might do a shorter kind of 400 to 800 meter semi-sprint based session, more anaerobic energy system on Tuesday, and then your Thursday might be a longer, slower duration, endurance based aerobic run. So again, many different ways to skin the cat. So choosing the system that works best for you and what you do for work, and not only what you do for work, but also your lifestyle as well, is going to be the most important thing, because there's no point having the best program that money can buy if you're not following it consistently. Now, I want to finish the episode with a couple of points here. There's 2 ways to get faster. One is by increasing stride length, which is done through strength. So if I have an athlete that, for educational purposes, takes 1,000 steps to cover 1,000 meters, if I make them stronger and they're producing more force, now they're going to increase their stride length. So they're going to cover the same distance of 1,000 meters with less steps, say 950 steps. That is increasing stride length done through strength. The second way of getting faster is by increasing stride frequency, which is done through speed. Whenever I have a client who wants to focus on running, I get them to run to a metronome, and the goal is to get them to roughly 90 steps per minute. Okay, so they're running to a metronome, bop, 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 bop. It doesn't matter if they're running uphill or downhill or on flat ground. The goal is to get them roughly 90 steps per minute. And when I say 90 steps per minute, that is a revolution. So I'm only counting every time my right foot hits the ground. That is the goal when we're running, is to build up to that 90 steps per minute. We build that cadence. So what we're doing here is covering the same ground, but turning those legs over a little bit faster and a little bit more efficiently, regardless of whether we're running uphill, downhill, or on flat ground. So there's the 2 main ways to get faster. That is build strength, which increases stride length, and then build speed, which increases stride frequency. Okay, if you can do both of those things simultaneously, then you're good to go, and that's going to bump your numbers up. And that is it from me today for today's Q&A session, guys. I apologize for going quite deep there, but this is a good point, is that I get asked these vague questions, and my answer is basically always, it depends. There's so many considerations that come into play. There's so many factors that need to be considered. So as a strength and conditioning coach, I answer these to the best of my ability. If you enjoy these episodes and you get something out of them, and there's people in your family, in your life, in your circle that you think can benefit from the message, all I ask is that you pass these episodes off to them, and in particular the episodes that are very pertinent to them. And if you're feeling the love, please leave me a 5-star rating and review, and I'll see you guys next week. Peace.